Ethiopian nobleman. How did Philip help him? What did he preach unto him? Preached unto him Jesus. We don't know exactly what was said, but at some point we know Philip had to mention baptism, didn't he? Because when they came to some water, that was the question that was asked. See, here's water. What's stopping me or hindering me, keeping me from being baptized? Paul, who I guess is still known as Saul at this point, chief persecutor of the church, on the road to Damascus, literally sees the light. Maybe that's where we get that expression from. The bright light shines. Eventually, Ananias comes and preaches to him. He believes. Arise. Why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized. And he was. And Paul begins to preach in the synagogues in Damascus, where he was on his way to persecute. I'll just put it up here. The disciples at Jerusalem. Why would they be afraid of Saul or Paul? They knew his reputation. And if anything, this might be a trick. He's done all this just to get close to us, to find out who we are and where we meet, because he had done some horrible things. He admitted he had done some horrible things. We also talked last week about the first Gentile convert. What was his name? Okay, Cornelius. He was a Roman soldier sent for Peter. Peter had saw the vision. God had prepared him to understand that now the message, salvation, was being opened to the Gentiles as well. And everything worked out just fine. Probably wouldn't have worked out fine if the Holy Spirit hadn't fallen on them, would it? Maybe. But it sure convinced them, didn't it? Sure convinced them, and we talked about that. And I didn't have this last week, but here was the reading for this week. Acts 10 to about Acts 21. Missing some of the chapters, but gives you an idea. So lesson 8 this week. Disciples first called Christians in what city? Acts 11. Acts chapter 11. Antioch. Antioch of Syria. If we get far enough in the questions today, we'll see that there is an additional town or city that's named Antioch. Antioch of Pisidia. But this is Antioch of Syria. It's going to become, as Jerusalem, I would say, would be the center of the book of Acts up to this point. A lot of what's going to take place going forward in the book of Acts seems to happen or be centered around this town of Antioch. A very pro-missionary town, we would say. So let's look at that. In Acts chapter 11, we find out that those that were scattered, why were they scattered? Okay, the persecution that was happening specifically around Jerusalem caused them to scatter, the Christians to scatter. And as they went, they were preaching the word, but they were preaching only to who? As it says there, they were preaching to Jews. Probably going into the synagogues where the Jews would be to worship and study. The Christians were leaving. They would go into synagogues, preach, debate, speak, talk, argue. But they were preaching only to the Jews. But then we find out that some of the men that were from Cyprus and Cyrene, who had spoke to the Hellenists being the Jews of a Greek background. They spoke to the Hellenists at Antioch, and a great many believed. So the church at Jerusalem, having heard that many believed, they sent Barnabas to Antioch, kind of oversee what's going on, take a look. So Barnabas is sent. Barnabas encouraged them, and then he went to find Saul. And Saul at this time, he had went back to, we call him Saul of Tarsus. We'd say that was his hometown. So Saul was in Tarsus, and Barnabas went to look for him. He found him, and he brought him back to Antioch. What do you think Paul did when he got to Antioch? He preached and taught, debated, discussed, argued with anybody he could find. We know that was his method of doing things. So Paul and Barnabas, they were assembled with the church. Down in verse 25. Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul. When he had found him, he brought him to Antioch, and it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. Okay, and then verse 26, that's what our question said. And the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. So what does that word Christian mean? Okay, follower of Christ, Christ-like, dealing with, having to do with, pertaining to Christ. Okay? We see that with other words that we use, but one that popped in my mind, Philippians. What is the letter to the Philippians? Pertaining to those that lived in Philippi, right? And we see that adding that suffix to the end of words, designated, signified, having to deal with, like Christ. So that's what Christians were. They were like Christ. They had to do with Christ. They were followers, disciples of the Christ. Have you all ever heard the debate about this word? Some say that this word was given as a mockery or a ridicule of the followers of Christ by those outside. You all never heard that? That's good. But I think we can prove that that's not true. Oh, that's just a bunch of Christians over there. They're trying to be Christ-like. And it was kind of mockery and ridicule. I am surprised that none of you have ever heard that. Okay. Tammy's heard it. I wasn't crazy. I knew that was out there. What's the other choice? It was given, authorized by God, wasn't it? And that's where we're going to end up. That's where we're going to land with this. Given by inspiration through the teaching of Paul and Barnabas. But let's go back to Isaiah chapter 62. Isaiah 62. Verse 1. Righteousness and salvation will go forth out of Jerusalem. It's a prophecy. Verse 2, Gentiles will see her righteousness. Kings her glory. What else does it say in verse 2? Be called by a new name which the Lord would give. Christian, that's a word that is well known in our world today, isn't it? And we're talking about the Bible. That's the book where we find out that we're supposed to be a Christian. So how many times do you think the word Christian is found in the Bible? Off the top of my head, I think, boy, that ought to be a lot. Does anybody know? 10? More than 10? Less than 10? Less than 10. What about 5? It's less than 5. 3 times the word Christian, the word that we're talking about, 3 times is found in the New Testament. It's not found in the Old Testament, found in the New Testament. It's found here, Acts 11:26. Anybody else got a guess? Know where it's found again? Acts 26:28. What that's about? Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And where else is it found? 1 Peter 4:16. Thank you, Tammy. Tammy, did you do your homework, or are you just that smart? 1 Peter 4:16. If any man suffer as a Christian, basically Peter says if you suffer as a Christian, you should be happy about that. And that's the 3 places that the word Christian's found. But the word called, they were called Christians first in Antioch. I'm going to try to say this. It's a Greek word. Krematidzo. Krematidzo. Nine times it's found. And it always has to do with something that seems to be a divine revelation. The wise man, Krematidzo, of God, they were warned of God. The wise man were warned of God, don't go back the way that you came. Don't go back and see Herod. Remember? Okay? Joseph, the same word, was warned of God to take Mary and go to Egypt. Mary and Jesus and go to Egypt. Cornelius was warned of God. It's the same word. Noah, Hebrews 11:7. King James says Noah was warned about that generation. It's also used as admonished. Hebrews 8:5. God admonished Moses about everything that was supposed to be in the tabernacle. Okay? So warned, admonished, spake. Hebrews 12:25, I think. I wrote that kind of small. Okay? It's translated as spake. Called, the word that we've got here, called Christians first in Antioch. Romans 7:3. The lady with a husband, I can't remember every detail about it, but she was called an adulteress. Okay? And it's also revealed. It's translated as revealed. So warned, admonished, spake, called, revealed. Simeon, it was revealed to Simeon that he would see the Christ before he died. Okay? In the book of, where's that at? In Matthew? No, it may be Luke. Luke, it was prophesied that he would not see death until he had seen the Christ. It's almost always a divine communication or a revelation with a high level of certainty I feel we can say that God authorized, God revealed, they were called Christians first in Antioch. This was approved by God, wasn't it? This wasn't a ridicule, this wasn't a mock. And it came through the inspired teachings of Barnabas and Paul. All right, Christians called first. In what city? That was Antioch. All right, next question. Card 67. Question 67. Who was the king that killed James and cast Peter into prison? Okay? This is Herod. Okay? I don't think it was Herod the Great. I think Herod the Great was the one that proclaimed that all the babies should be killed. I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is maybe even as a grandson, Herod Antipas. Okay? But we're just going to call him Herod. Okay? All right. King Herod was bringing persecution upon some that were in the church. He took James. This is James, the brother of John, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, the son of Zebedee. He took him and he beheaded him with a sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he said, I better not do that anymore. No, he doubled down, didn't he? Remember, in the beginning of this, they really couldn't touch the apostles. They couldn't touch those that were preaching on the day of Pentecost. They got Stephen because he was, I hate to use the term underling, but he wasn't one of the apostles, was he? Started driving them out. But now they're becoming more and more bold. They've taken James, an apostle. They killed him. They've now put Peter in a prison. What happened with Peter? They had him under heavy guard, didn't they? Made him sleep, bound by a soldier on each side in chains. Some point during the night, what happened? Peter's awakened, isn't he? By an angel. Chains fall off. Get up, get out quickly, the message was to Peter. As he's walking toward the gate, what happens? There's nobody there, but the gate opens, doesn't it? Once Peter gets outside, he realizes that God's delivered him. And something that I always remembered from this account, when he gets to the home of Mary, who's John Mark's mother, he's knocking at the outside, and a young girl comes and sees Peter, and she doesn't let him in, does she? She runs and tells the rest of them it's Peter. They don't believe her at first, but he continues to knock, and then everything's fine. But I always thought he's trying to be secretive, trying to get someplace, seemed to me. And she just left him outside. Kind of almost seemed a little scatterbrained, but maybe that's not what it was. I'm sure it was excitement or being overwhelmed, not knowing what was going on. But what was her name? Rhoda. Rhoda, exactly right. All right, 68. Now, most of these cards are pretty much just, you just need to know them. There's not a whole lot of, doctrinal discussion that needs to take place, so we're going to try to just get through them. The number of missionary journeys Paul made. 3 missionary journeys. There was a 4th journey when he was in prison under arrest. Maybe that's the best way to say that. But the number of missionary journeys he made was 3, each starting from what city? The one we've just talked about, Antioch. Okay? With a variety and different partners and helpers that went with him. We also see about this time Acts 13:9. Somebody get there and read Acts 13:9. A significant event. Now, Barry asked to read on Wednesday night, and it's just like that. Now, come on, people. Okay, Saul, who was also called Paul. From this point forward, this persecutor, chief persecutor, is going to be known as Paul. Be an argument that the greatest missionary the world's ever seen. Maybe not even an argument. But Saul is called Paul, Acts 13:9. Write that down if you're interested. All right, so who did Paul? And on the first journey, it's Barnabas, isn't it? Who did they visit on the first missionary journey? I'll leave this up there for just a second. You can write it down. Then I've got a map. As I went through and put this PowerPoint together, I must have got tired. Because on the first missionary journey, I've got lots of details, and then as I got further and further into it, it just kind of dwindled down a little bit. So you'll notice that. But not that it's not just as important or things that happen are more important. It's just the way it turned out. The island of Cyprus, Asia Minor, and then the return trip home. Here's the map. I don't know. That actually shows up a lot better than I thought it would. Leaving out of Antioch, and if you don't realize, this is the northeast area of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay. That didn't help, did it? I have to get Barry to show me again. The area at the top where it actually says first missionary journey, that's Asia Minor, Turkey, that area of the world today. And of course, the body of water is the Mediterranean Sea. But anyway, they go south down through Cyprus up into Asia Minor. The reason this is important, yes, there's a lot of details and facts that take place here, but it is setting up the rest of the New Testament. The letters that Paul writes to these congregations, you're going to find most of them are located in this area. If you look up at the top corner, there's the other Antioch, the Antioch of Pisidia. This is the area, Galatia, the churches of Galatia. So this is an important missionary journey. Goes to the island of Cyprus. Elymas tried to withstand them, and he's caused to go blind for a while. They go to Perga. This is where John Mark turned back. So a lot of significant or things that we think about or remember. Iconia. Paul converted many Jews and Greeks, but had to leave because of unbelieving Jews. Think about what's happened to Paul. He has went from the persecutor to the persecuted. And the same thing that he did to Christians, these Jews are trying to do to him. I think that shows his zeal, his commitment to the cause. If he wasn't truly resilient with his belief, he would have given it up. People are trying to kill him. And we'll see here, I think they did kill him. Or if not, he got really close, didn't he? So at Lystra, he healed a lame man. The people tried to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods and sacrifice to them. Paul and Barnabas tore their clothes, said, "Don't do this. You're men. We are men just like you are." And he was stoned and left for dead. He talks about that later in one of the letters. And it tends you to believe, or tends to make you want to believe, that he died and then something miraculous happened. But if not, he got very close. But he was stoned, left for dead by the Jews, these Jews who had come to Lystra from Antioch, the Antioch of Pisidia, and from Iconium. He had made them mad, hadn't he? Remember? Had to be let down the basket to avoid them. They were plotting in Jerusalem to kill him. It seemed like every turn, every twist, he's upset them. At Derbe, he made many disciples, and then he returned home by retracing the way through Asia Minor, appointing, I think this is important, appointing elders in every congregation. He sailed from Perga back to Antioch, Antioch of Syria. Any questions about that? I know that's, once again, this is a survey. So get the high points and the details, and then we'll cover it more detail in later series. What are the places he visited on the second missionary journey? Went to Asia Minor, places that he'd just been, returning, checking on those people and those congregations. Very significant fact here, he goes to Europe. The Macedonian call, we'll talk about that. And then his return trip. Asia Minor, Europe, return trip. Doesn't have the red on there, but you can follow the arrow. From Antioch, instead of going south to Cyprus this time, he just stays on the land, goes around into Asia Minor. We can see the places, and we'll talk about each one of those. Just makes a circle. We see he goes over from Troas over into Macedonia, Thessalonica, Athens, Corinth. We know about those cities. Circles back around, touches in Asia Minor again in Ephesus, then swings around and comes back to Caesarea, goes down to Jerusalem, and then back to Antioch to report everything that had been going on. But let's talk a little bit more in detail. Paul's second missionary journey, he's now with Silas. Remember the contention between him and Barnabas. John Mark turned back. It was so great that they decided to split up. So now Paul is with Silas. He goes to Derbe, then to Lystra, where Timothy joined them. He visits the area around Phrygia and Galatia. At Troas, talked about this, he received the vision, come over to Macedonia, the Macedonian call. So the gospel is preached in Europe. From Troas, he continues through Europe, visiting Philippi, where he converted Lydia and the jailer. We talked about that a little bit last week. Visits Thessalonica, Berea. What was the significance about Berea? Don't look up there and read it, Jerry. I saw Jerry. No, he was reading it with his eyes, but his lips were moving a little bit too. I think we all do that. Even when we're reading silent, our lips move. At Berea, they were the ones who were more noble because they searched the Scriptures daily to see if the things that Paul was preaching were true. We need to follow that example, right? I like Barry. I love Barry. But we don't just let Barry get a slide, do we? We need to be following in our Bible. You need to be checking me out. Follow along. If something's said, raise your hand. Let's speak about it. Okay? That's what they did. They searched the Scriptures. Now, these Scriptures would have been what? Been the Old Testament, what we would call the Old Testament. But they searched that Scriptures. He then goes to Athens. What happens in Athens? We'll talk about that hopefully here in a minute. Athens, Corinth, Cenchrea. I think that's how you say that. And then on a return trip, he returned to Ephesus and to Caesarea before going to Jerusalem and back to Antioch. Where did he visit on his third missionary journey? Ephesus gets special mentioned here. Stayed there for a while. Ephesus, Europe, and then the return trip. Ephesus, Europe, and the return trip. So once again, from Antioch, takes the land route, goes to Ephesus, stays there for a while, and basically revisits the places that he had visited before, planting congregations. Went to Ephesus. He stayed there at least 2 years. One of the things that happened, the 7 sons of Sceva were overpowered and wounded by an evil spirit they were trying to exorcise. Because of this event, this is where they had the book burning. Many brought their books, burned them in the sight of all. Paul returned to Troas, preached till midnight. Young man fell out the window named Eutychus. Fell down, he was dead. Paul raised him. That was there in Troas on the 3rd missionary journey. Made stops at all those places. You can look at the names there. At Tyre, Paul was warned by Agabus not to go to Jerusalem. You'll be put in chains if you go to Jerusalem. That's not going to stop Paul, is it? All right, the problem discussed at Jerusalem. 72. Whether Gentile Christians should be required to keep the law of Moses. Specifically, what seemed to be the highlight. What portion? Circumcision. That seemed to be the focal point. But it's whether Gentile Christians should be required to keep any or all of the law of Moses. Which leads me to think that up until this point, the Jews that were now Christians, if they were wanting the Gentiles to keep the law, what were they doing? They were keeping the law. So even though they were not going to be required to do that, they were keeping the law. So there's a problem that arose and was discussed in Jerusalem. Some of the Jewish disciples felt that all Gentile converts must keep the law of Moses. Peter rehearsed his conversion of Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, and told him that he was saved without the law of Moses. Cornelius was saved. He was baptized, believed and baptized. He was not keeping the law of Moses. He was a good man, gave alms, prayed. But Peter said he was saved without the law of Moses. James, not James, the brother of John, remember he had been killed by Herod. This is James, most likely brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus. He quoted from the Old Testament to support the idea that God intended salvation for the Gentiles. So what was the decision? The decision at this meeting was that Gentiles did not have to keep the law of Moses. They sent letters to Antioch. Okay? Letters were sent by the hands of Barnabas and Paul, but also Silas and a fellow named Judas went as witnesses, word of mouth, to confirm what was being said. All right. Didn't get them all in, did we? Here's the deal. I'm going to put lesson number 9 out there because we will finish up for sure lesson 8 next week, and I want you to have 9, and we will start with 9. So I'll put the sheet for 9 out on the board. Okay? Appreciate your cooperation with letting me just ramble. We'll take a short break, and then we'll be back for a word.